Kia ora. We're up to talking about analysis. Now, this is the part that I find really, really exciting. I nearly just said fart. I find it really exciting because you get to really explore your ideas. Not Lois Lowry's ideas, not my ideas, but your ideas. And talk about how you see the giver connecting to other texts or the real world. And this is the stuff in English that we really enjoy. It's those discussions that we get to have, those arguments that we get to make. So, step 9, analysis. Here's the question, here's the essay, here's the paragraph, here's the beginning of the paragraph, here's our analysis. This event teaches us how significant individuality is when following the road of self-discovery, as well as presenting the idea that recognizing one's independence is a critical part of growing up. This event is comparable to that of Tris taking her aptitude test in Divergent. Both events allow the character to realise their distinction from the rest of their community. Although these situations are unalike in the way that Jonas is honoured for his individuality, whereas Tris is forced to hide her own originality, both events end with the same consequences as both characters use their independence as a tool to rebel from their society. That comma in red is supposed to be deleted, but I forgot to delete it. It shouldn't be there at all. Right, let's have a look at breaking this down. So what? That is a good question to ask yourself when you're preparing to write an analysis. So let's go back 2 slides. Our explanation. Lowry shows how unfamiliar this feeling of detachment is for Jonas and stresses how significant his unification with his community was, therefore displaying how dramatically this change in alliance has affected Jonas as a character. Becoming an individual is essential to Jonas's defiance of sameness, and this quote conveys his recognition of his own independence. So what? Who cares? Why is this important? Why does it matter? Why are you writing about this? These are the kinds of questions you could ask yourself. You could also ask yourself, how does it affect the community? How does it affect the reader? How does it affect Jonas? How does it affect the giver? Why has Lowry written this? What is she trying to say? Is she trying to compare this to the real world? Is she trying to make us remember another book that we've read once? These are all really good questions to ask ourselves to stimulate our ideas. So what? This event teaches us how significant individuality is when following the road of self-discovery, as well as presenting the idea that recognizing one's independence is a critical part of growing up. That's so what? That would be a fantastic analysis as is. That kind of, if you were to do that, that's a strong merit or maybe an excellence if you do it across all 3 paragraphs right there at year 10. So this student has said that the event, it tells us about how when you discover yourself, it's so important to recognize that you are an individual, and it's also a really important part of growing up. Being independent is a really important part of growing up. And that's fantastic. What an awesome thought to realize that the giver is telling us. It may be obvious to us, but to see that the giver is exploring this idea is really awesome. Something else you can do in your analysis is compare to another story. Now, often students want to compare to film because they find it easier to remember. But think of it this way. A book is a book and a film is a film. Film uses lots of different things to tell a story, like sound and dialogue and camera techniques and colour and costume. A book uses words, which make up a story, or as we call it in English, a narrative. When you are comparing books with books, you are comparing narratives. And that is what we are going to analyse here when we talk about Divergent, is we're talking about 2 narratives that use similar turning points. If you want to talk about a film and the film was originally a book, talk about the book. If you want to talk about a film and there is no book of the film, don't. Find a story or a book to talk about instead. Now that's another important thing to realize, is you don't have to talk about an entire novel. It could be a fable, or a children's storybook, or a myth, because all of those primarily use narrative or story to get their point across. The other thing to remember is at year 10, you so don't have to have read the book. No one's going to know. If you want to refer to Aesop's fable about the tortoise and the hare and you've never actually read it, that's fine. You might have read a shortened version of it. Chances are you haven't read the actual original, but that's okay because you know the narrative. If you want to refer to a segment of the Bible, you don't have to have read it. You get the gist of the story of Noah and the ark, and if you want to compare that narrative to a narrative you're talking about in English, that's totally cool. No one's going to know that you haven't actually read those segments of the Bible. So my point overall is, though, that when you are writing about a written text, you must compare narratives. So you need to find a written text or an oral text to compare it to. When you're writing about film, you find a film. So this event is comparable to that of Tris taking her aptitude test in Divergent. Awesome, compare it. Don't forget, though, you can also contrast it. It's okay if the stories are not identical, because if they were, there would be copyright infringement problems going on here. There are all sorts of stories that have all sorts of similarities, and they all have their differences as well. So if the contrast is relevant, then acknowledge it. It's totally cool to acknowledge it. You know, it's relevant here that Jonas is honoured for his difference, whereas Tris is maligned for her difference. Another super easy example would be, you can always use these as go-to examples of analysis if you're not sure what to do. Harry Potter, especially for something like this. Like, Harry Potter goes through the Sorting Hat. That would be the turning point, and it is decided that he will be in Gryffindor. Or, of course, the turning point could be when Voldemort actually tries to kill him at the beginning, the very beginning, like, of his life. Obviously a turning point, because then he becomes the chosen one as opposed to Neville being the chosen one. Spoiler alert! Then we finish with, both characters use their independence as a tool to rebel from their society. Why did you say that? Why was that valuable? Well, it shows that you understand that there's a world of fiction out there and that the giver doesn't exist in a vacuum. Now, you wouldn't have to stop there. That's the fantastic, wonderful, beautiful thing about analysis. As long as what you continue to say is relevant and adds something to your argument, then you should continue to explore. You should continue to tell your reader about the ideas that you have. We want to hear your wonderful, fabulous new ideas. So, for example, you could go on to say about how authors explore the world of young teenagers as they go from being children to teenagers and therefore adulthood. There is actually a word for that, and I taught it to you. It's a German word. I can't remember it off the top of my head right now, but it is a type of story in German fiction, and that word applies to this idea of people growing up. Take any young adult fiction that is popular nowadays, and it is basically following the story of somebody going from being essentially a child to essentially an adult. They may not, they may not go from being 10 years old to 18, but the path that their character takes is one from childhood to adulthood. Katniss Everdeen is another perfect example of that. She goes from being, she has certain responsibilities, but they're only to her mother and to her sister. Then she goes on this path which makes her not just an adult, but an actual leader for an entire nation. Okay, so she goes through a kind of meta transition from being a sort of adult to being not just an adult, but responsible for many, 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 many people. And again, that would be an easy example to use here of a turning point, when Primrose's name is pulled out of the bowl and Katniss volunteers, that is a huge turning point in the story, and again one that shows somebody becoming individual, independent, unique, and therefore that leads them to rebel from their society. So it's not just about recognizing that, though. It's about then discussing, okay, well, why do authors do this? Why do they tell us these stories? Why do we enjoy these stories? Why do adults enjoy these stories? Like, why is it that a book like The Giver and books like Divergent and The Hunger Games have resonance not just with teenagers but with adults as well? Okay. Now, just like with your explanations, analysis are so particular to your individual essay. So I might have just said some ideas which might have sparked ideas for you. You might be thinking, oh yeah, I could talk about that and that and that, and that really helps. Or you might be sitting there thinking, but I'm not talking about a turning point, and I can't talk about Tris because it's not relevant, and neither is The Hunger Games, and neither is Harry Potter. That's when you need to come to me, and I can read what you've done so far and ask you specific questions to tease out analysis. You are all capable of doing analysis. When we discuss stuff in class, that is what we are doing. Every single person in our class is capable of completing analysis verbally. It's whether or not you can have the control over your thoughts to then put it into your writing. So if you're struggling with this, that's totally normal. Get me to give you some specific questions to tease out that analysis. Or go back to the bit sort of in the middle of this tutorial where I put forward some questions to ask yourselves. Those questions like, so what, who cares, why does this matter, etc. So analysis, the most fun part of an essay, the whole reason really why we write essays, so that we can communicate our own individual point of view and convince somebody of this really exciting argument that we've come up with. And the better you get at analysis, the better your essay writing will be. So time to have a go at writing your own analysis before you move on to writing a summary statement.